there, and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Kapelos in Ottawa on this Thursday. Tonight, political bombshell in BC.
I was not prepared to go forward and have that civil war and drive that divide, because I believe strongly that we need that common sense change in British Columbia, and there's only one way to deliver that.
BC Conservative leader John Rustad announces he's stepping down less than 24 hours after insisting he wasn't going anywhere. What led to the caucus revolt against him, and why is he staying on as an MLA? Mr. Rustad will be here live in moments, and I'll ask him. Then, the future of CUSMA.
It expires in about a year, and we'll either let it expire or we'll maybe work out another deal.
Canada enters this CUSMA review at a time of profound global change.
With public hearings on the trade deal underway in Washington, U.S. President Donald Trump says he's open to letting it expire. Prime Minister Mark Carney is also set to be face-to-face with Trump tomorrow in D.C. as talks remain at a standstill. Our front bench with Christy Clark, Marco Medicino, James Moore, and Corey tonight will be here coming up with a preview. Plus, reaching out.
What we talked about today was a process for how projects can be developed. They will be developed in partnership with First Nations.
This MOU is a slap in the face of British Columbia.
Energy Minister Tim Hodgson meets in person with BC First Nations chiefs about a potential pipeline going to the West Coast. Some coastal First Nations there are opposed to the project. So how did the talks go? Our Mike LeCouture was inside the room as they all met, and he'll be here with a debrief a little bit later on in the show. First, though.
A letter with 20 MLAs is calling on you to resign. Are you going to resign?
No. I am planning to stay on as the Conservative leader of the Conservative Party British Columbia leader. I'm not planning to step aside at this point. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. I talked to many of my supporters. I talked to the core people that have been around me, talked to my wife. They all encouraged me to carry on with this fight. But in order to do that would be the creation of a civil war within the Conservative Party British Columbia. And that is not in the interest of this party, it's not in the interest of our members, and I don't think it's the interest of British Columbia.
It has been a dramatic 24 hours in BC politics. Conservative leader John Rustad has officially resigned a day after saying he wouldn't be going anywhere. Yesterday, 20 MLAs signed a letter saying they lost confidence in him, and party brass tried to remove him as leader, declaring his leadership, quote, professionally incapacitated. Rustad initially said he would not step down, but has since reversed course, as you just heard, to stave off what he calls a, quote, civil war in the party. MLA Trevor Halford will now lead the party in the interim.
You know, I've known John for over 20 years. When I first came in this building and started as an ALA, assistant, legislative assistant, the word assistant twice in my title, John was there. And John has been a friend, he's been a mentor, and he's gotten us to this place. Yeah. Here. And we have a duty to him, we have a duty to British Columbians to get us to that next chapter.
As for Mr. Rustad, he says he will continue to stay on as an MLA for now, but will not run in the next election. And Mr. Rustad joins us live, I believe, from the BC legislature right now. Hi there. Good to meet you. Good to have you on the program. Thanks for making the time.
It's good to meet you as well. Thank you for having me on today.
Mr. Rustad, we just heard you explain to British Columbians who were watching that you stepped down today to avoid your party descending into a, quote, civil war. Respectfully, hadn't it already?
No, I think there's a lot of internal squabbling that's been going on. There's lots of issues that have been happening. But when you start, legal battles, when you start a process that could ultimately drive people away and split the party into different factions, I think that is what the risk is here. And, first and foremost, I've always said that being a leader is about standing for what's right, fighting for the average everyday person. And so if I was going to carry on with that fight, I started thinking about it and realized that's actually now about me, not about leadership, not about what's in the best interest of the province or the party. And that's what ultimately led me to the decision to change my position and to resign as leader of the Conservative Party of British Columbia today.
with great respect, Mr. Rustad, why didn't you come to the realization that it would be about you earlier? And I ask because as I look through what's unfolded over the last number of months, I mean, you came so close to winning the election, but since then you lost 5 MLAs, some of whom have said directly that your leadership or lack thereof was a part of why they were leaving. Yes, you got nearly 71% in your leadership review, but less than 20% of members even voted. Fundraising is so low that likely in this fourth quarter you will be out fundraised by the Greens. In October, your party president and 6 other members of the management committee wrote to you asking you to step down. How much better shape would your party be in today if you had made this decision sooner, sir?
Well, that's an interesting question, and any party that has a leadership change in terms of going through a leadership race faces all kinds of challenges and issues. There are certainly still issues within the Conservative Party of British Columbia that need to be cleaned up. Those are issues that I was trying to work on to get addressed, but unfortunately, we're in a situation where that was becoming impossible to be able to actually fix moving forward. As you know, in politics, there's always people with differing views. There's always different people that want to see their perspective come forward in a party. And the Conservative Party of British Columbia is no different than that. And those became dominant, where what we should have been doing is talking more and more about the issues in British Columbia. The opposition to an oil pipeline, the fact that we've got our forest sector in a crisis, the fact that we've got drugs and crime that are rampant in our streets, a deficit, quite frankly, that's on the road to bankruptcy. These are the things that I have been focused on and talking about, but it's clear to me now that it's going to be impossible to carry on with that type of conversation and fight while the infighting is carrying on within the Conservative Party of British Columbia.
I think you make a good point, Mr. Rustad, in that any democracy functions best when there is a very strong opposition. And so I'll put to you again, what responsibility do you, as leader of the party, bear for the diminishing strength of your party in opposition? And I understand that there are squabbles. There's one MLA who leaves or another. There can be friction. But this was not isolated, right? I mean, you have one MLA who quit your caucus who said that, and quoted you, that if they didn't like his leadership, they can get the F out. Again, Mr. Rustad, with great respect, what responsibility do you bear for the position your party finds itself in today?
Well, let's look at where our party is. We are, according to the latest polls, we're somewhere between 2 and 8 points up in a lead over the NDP. So I would ask, is that a bad position for our party to be in? I would say no. Our party has actually been very effective in holding this government to account. We've been very effective on the issues that matter to British Columbians. They've been fighting these issues. We've been continuing to connect with people around the province. Unfortunately, like I say, when you have this kind of infighting and stuff that's going on, it runs the risk of losing the narrative of the Conservative Party being ready to lead and to fight the next election. And that's what I have to consider first and foremost. But as for holding the government to account, I mean, we've been doing that very well, very effectively. As a matter of fact, we just wrapped up the fall sitting of the legislature here in British Columbia. And, I would say that the governing party, the NDP, have had a very bad time, a very rough time of it this fall.
Do you think, and believe me, I've had multiple opportunities where I've given really hard interviews to the Premier, so I do take your point on accountability on that side of the legislature. But do you really, Mr. Rustad, think that if you had been leader of the party and headed to an election anytime soon, you could have won? I mean, all the speculation in your province right now is that the Premier is going to head to an election soon because he thinks he can secure a bigger win.
Well, this is the risk now in terms of the step that I've taken. If I had have taken it earlier, I do know for a fact that the Premier was doing all the work to prep for an election this fall. He was hiring additional people to come in. He was working on his teams and strategy. He was approaching people about running as appointments in a snap election. They were doing everything to prep for an election. So if we had been into a leadership race, 2 or 3 months ago, we very well might have been in a position where we would be facing an election. But I think it's highly unlikely at this particular point, especially given the deficit that the NDP is in terms of the polls, where we're sitting in a 2 to 8 point lead. I think it would be very highly unlikely that they will go to election at this particular point. But it certainly was a significant risk this fall, and it's one of the reasons why I needed to stay in place and continue the fight, even with the internal issues that were going on.
But those internal issues have now led to a situation where if your parties were to go to an election, the NDP, I read today, has amassed a war chest of $9 million in assets. Your party is on track to raise only $350,000 in the fourth quarter. Like, how can you argue tonight that you put your party in a relatively better position to fight an election when the math just doesn't add up?
Well, first of all, I don't believe those numbers, and that number was put out, and quite frankly, I think it's a false number. I know exactly where the finances are in the party. I know how much money that we have, and I know what our burn rate is, and I also know the amount of money that was coming in. I know the fundraising that was lined up for the month of December, and I can tell you it would have been significantly higher than the number that you have quoted. So I was not feared, and I'm still not afraid of going to an election. But it's probably worth noting that money is important in an election, but money doesn't win an election. If that was the case, I would expect the Conservative Party, the Federal Conservative Party would have won the last election. They had way more money than the Federal Liberal Party. But money, like I say, doesn't make the difference. It helps, but it is not the only factor in elections.
You're going to stay on as an MLA. I heard you say in your press conference today, but you won't run in the next election. Do you think, there's a lot that went on behind the scenes right up until the last hour yesterday with, a slim majority of your MLAs essentially signing a letter asking you to step aside. Is your presence in caucus going to be divisive?
I don't think so. At least certainly that's my hope. The way I've always worked, I don't hold grudges. I have no hard feelings towards anybody. My role that I see as a former leader of this party, and certainly when I was the leader of this party, is always to do what is right, to fight, to build the party, to make sure I support our caucus, and to make sure that we're as well positioned as we can for the next election. That doesn't change just because I've stepped down as leader. I'm prepared to do the work that caucus would like me to do to be able to support the party. I'm prepared to actually do the work of continuing to strengthen this party and try to build out the membership in this party. And in whatever role and capacity that I need to be there, that's what I will do. And if some people have an issue with me being there, I'll find ways to be able to work through that, listening to their voices and finding out how it can work. But certainly in the conversations I've had with many of the caucus members at this point, they have no issue with me staying on. There may be some that do, but I'm sure we'll work through those issues.
Should your colleagues trust you when you say you'll be able to work through it, particularly since you were not able to as leader?
Well, it's a very different situation when you're the leader because you obviously got all these different views and you're trying to weigh one view over another. As a caucus member, it's a support role in terms of where the party is going and how we are going after the NDP. I think the error on my part would be, quite frankly, if I were to try to assert myself as being leader or with the ideas, and that's certainly not going to be my intent. My intent is to be able to support our caucus, to be able to support our party, and to carry on with pushing for the issues that are important to me and that I think are important for British Columbia, which is bringing that common sense government, fiscally responsible government into place into British Columbia and winning this next election.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. Mr. Rustad, appreciate your time this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on. Take care.
You as well. That's the outgoing leader of the BC Conservative Party, John Rustad. We're going to take a quick commercial break tonight on Power Play. After that break, Washington bound. Prime Minister Mark Carney is heading to D.C., where he's expected to briefly meet with U.S. President Donald Trump. What should Canadians expect or not expect? Our front bench, Marco Mendicino, Christy Clark, James Moore, and Corey Tonight. There they all are. They're with me after a short break. Stay right there.
We're the only country right now of the G7 that has zero tariff overall on our economy. On certain sectors, things are going well, actually, and our plan is working. But in the sectors that are impacted by the tariffs, the pain is real. And so we provide the information to the negotiating team with what are the impacts of the tariffs. And that's how the Prime Minister and Dominic LeBlanc, Minister LeBlanc, and the clerk and the chief of staff, also the prime minister, are able, and Kirsten Hellman, our ambassador to the U.S., are able to negotiate.
Industry Minister Melanie Joly at a House of Commons committee earlier on the upcoming review of CUSMA. Canadian business officials are also testifying before the United States Trade Representative in Washington at the very moment we're speaking, and urging for a timely renewal of the deal. All of that happening as U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer told Politico that Donald Trump could decide next year to simply withdraw from CUSMA. And all of it happening just as Prime Minister Mark Carney is set to have a quote-unquote brief meeting with Donald Trump tomorrow. The Prime Minister will also meet separately with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. The leaders will all be in Washington for the FIFA World Cup draw, with trade talks between Canada and the U.S. still on ice. While the Feds are trying to lower expectations ahead of that meeting tomorrow, the opposition is urging the Prime Minister to keep to his word.
The Prime Minister promised that he'd negotiate a win with President Trump by July 21st and get the tariffs removed. Here we are, and the tariffs are higher than ever before. So it's time for the Prime Minister to keep his word, negotiate a win, and put Canada first for a change.
So what is at stake right now in Washington? Let's bring in our front bench. Former BC Premier Christy Clark is here. She's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. Marco Mendicino is former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Mark Carney and a former Liberal cabinet minister. He's now a senior counsel and strategic advisor for Castles. CTV political analyst and former Conservative Industry Minister James Moore is with us. He's now a policy advisor at Edelman. And Corey Teneycke was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former Director of Communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He's now CEO of Rubicon Strategy. Hi, everyone. Happy Thursday evening. Lots for us to unpack on multiple fronts. I'm going to start with Washington and this trip in particular tomorrow. Christy, is it about avoiding disaster or actually trying to make gains for the Prime Minister?
I don't think there's going to be much accomplished in a short meeting that they're going to have. I mean, these meetings on the sometimes you can do a longer meeting on the margin of a big confab where you're meeting about something, but this is about FIFA, and it's going to be a big, a completely different focus. I think it's going to be hard to get the president to fully engage on these issues in this context. I think, Carney will probably do the best that he can, but I don't think we should have huge hopes for it. Every one of these is relationship building. That's good. The president of Mexico will be there. That's good. I mean, those relationships really matter. But my view of this has always been that President Trump, cagey negotiator that he is likely to leave Canada for the very last. And so when he says he may not renegotiate the deal at all, I think that's very real. Or if we just end up waiting for a long time until the very end of the rest of all of his tariff work that he's doing, I think that's a very real likelihood for Canada too. And it's better if we get a deal done at the end of the day, but it will be at the end of the day if we get a deal.
James, do you think it is possible or real that the president could walk away from CUSMA? I mean, it's not nothing. It's such a significant part of why our economy remains as insulated as it is. Not to say that the damage, on certain sectors isn't very punctuated, but overall, because 85% of the trade is still covered by CUSMA, it has definitely led to a lot of resilience. Do you think the possibility exists that disappears?
No, I think he'll threaten it, but I don't think it'll actually happen. And the president doesn't actually have the power to unilaterally collapse CUSMA. It has to go back to Congress. And as you saw in the special elections in Tennessee and the other elections that happened last month, that the grip of the president on Congress is not particularly strong. Polling market has it about 80%. The Democrats would win back control of Congress. And the president can't unilaterally just pull the CUSMA agreement out from underneath the American economy. This is a trilateral agreement, and the process to actually undo it and withdraw is complex. So, and you saw business leaders one by one going before Congress and making presentations to the president at great risk to their sort of reputational heat that they could get from the president over social media to say, look, this is an agreement that you negotiated, that you asked for, that you signed, that you delivered, that has been of enormous accretive benefit to our companies and to the North American platform and to these American companies. So I think Donald Trump will be a tough guy right up until the very end, should we get to that. He will certainly try to squeeze Canada for some kind of concessions that he could brag about and boast about. Often the symbolic victories are more important than substantive ones, and often the ones that he thinks that are substantive are actually not real wins for the American economy. So you're kind of shadowboxing with the impossible unpredictability of Donald Trump, which is why I think for Canada, the long game is to keep the long game, and don't do anything in a very quick and hastened way.
James's point is well taken. That and certainly if you've been listening or reading any of the testimonies so far, all the USMCA hearings that are going on, Marco, there are like a surprising number. Finally, it feels like of businesses who are saying like, keep it. This is actually good for us and for the American economy. At the same time, you have this juxtaposition yesterday in the Oval Office of the CEOs of the big auto companies like Stellantis, like GM, standing next to the president and just, you know, throwing adulation his way for the wonderful tariffs and all the production that has brought on side to the United States. Like, what do we take from that as Canadians?
Well, let's start with symbolism, and I'm going to pick up on the juxtaposition that James just articulated. I do think it is quite symbolic that tomorrow Prime Minister Mark Carney is going to Washington to celebrate the trilateral hosting of FIFA, which is the largest sporting event in the world, will be watched by the most number of eyeballs in the world, along with the United States and Mexico. And I might disagree a little bit with James on substance. I think substance is important when it comes to the trade relationship. And that's one of the reasons why the Prime Minister continues to tout that we have still the best deal in the world when it comes to the effective tariff rate. Now, that said, there is a lot of uncertainty. And as we've discussed before, there have been fits and spurts when it comes to the negotiation cycle, which is why it's important that Canada continues to project that we will protect workers in the most impacted sectors of our economy, that we will hold fast when it comes to protecting the principles of the trade agreement that we have with the United States and Mexico, regardless of how it's branded, and that patience is a cornerstone of the Prime Minister and the government strategy right now.
I totally get that, Corey, and I understand like strategically how that makes sense. Waiting it out makes sense. But this week we have ample evidence of the pain in the interim, right? And like what that means on the ground in 1,000 layoffs at Algoma Steel, the shuttering of a lumber operation in British Columbia, more concern about that happening on the East Coast as well. Like, how do you balance those things? Like, and are they doing a good job at it?
I don't think there's any easy path here, but I will point out, while there have been job losses in Canada and the pain is real here, you know, the U.S. just, received more data that we're in their 9th consecutive month of declines in employment and manufacturing in the U.S. You know, the U.S. tariff policy, the president's tariff policy, isn't just hurting Canada and other countries, it's hurting themselves at the same time. You know, there isn't an auto company in North America that can produce a single car on its own. You know, these are all things that we do together in a very integrated supply chain that we've built up over, 40 years. And the disruption of these tariffs is hurting Canada for sure, particularly aluminum, steel, autos, softwood lumber. But the uncertainty that U.S. trade policy is putting into the market is probably hurting us more. So, even the unaffected areas that aren't facing tariffs are certainly experiencing the same sort of investment chill that we're seeing in the U.S. as well. At the end of the day, the president's trade policy may be his political undoing.
I have to do a 180 because we were just talking to John Rustad, the outgoing leader of the BC Conservative Party. I have like BC royalty on this panel, so it's incumbent on me to get everyone. I know Corey's done a lot of work out there as well. Christy, I'll start with you. As you saw the last 24 hours unfold, which were dramatic by BC standards, but by Canadian standards too, like what's been going through your mind, and what do you think the future of that party is?
Well, first, that was a very good interview you did with him, Vashi. I thought you got more out of him than I've ever seen him give in an interview, so well done on that. John Rustad we're all kind of reliving 1991 in British Columbia because that was a moment when the Liberal Party just re-emerged with a new leader, and there hadn't been a Liberal in the legislature before, and they got there, they became official opposition out of nowhere, and then the leader fell apart and the party fell apart, and the thing was saved at the end of the day because a new leader came in who was, Gordon Campbell, very competent, well-known, former mayor, very successful in his job, and became the leader of the BC Liberal Party. And then we governed for 15, 16 years in British Columbia. So, good on John Rustad stepping up and starting a whole new party, riding the Pierre Poilievre coattails as long as he did. But, just like Gordon Wilson, I'm not sure he necessarily had the skills to be able to take that next step and turn this into a real thing. Now, who knows whether or not that'll happen? Everything will depend on who they choose as leader and whether or not that leader is able to bring together everyone in the province who doesn't want to vote NDP. If they fail to do that, and this is my partisanship showing, we are going to have another 4 years of New Democrats, absolutely guaranteed. So, if you care about the economy in British Columbia, this is a pretty important issue.
Is that inability to bring together disparate voices or disparate viewpoints under this big, we're not the NDP umbrella, ultimately why you think James Rustad failed as leader?
A combination of things. I don't know that he had the chops to do it himself, the interpersonal skills or the heft and weight of his personality and his charisma. I think he frankly lacked both. He was sort of the front rank of the second rank of leaders, and you need a first rank leader. We have in our system, of course, we have a parliamentary system, but we have presidential style politics. And to Christy's point, it's all about the leader. It's all about a leader's ability to draw people in and to get them focused on an agenda and a platform that makes sense. And there's a lot on the table for British Columbians who are of the broad free enterprise mindset to rally around, right? The Comox decision and the insecurity that exists in the investment community to invest in creating jobs in British Columbia because of the uncertainty about land claims and where the courts are going, the private property ownership question, the flight of capital and investment, Nutrien going to Vancouver, Washington instead of Vancouver, British Columbia. There's plenty on the table here in substantive policy for someone who would be cultured and thoughtful, who could sell in the Okanagan, but also Vancouver Island and Prince George, and do very well in the city of Vancouver. So the broad free enterprise coalition is now fractured. It's not just the BC Conservative Party. There's still, there are two independents. There are two people sitting in this one BC party, which is just antagonistic towards First Nations. Then you have three independents. Like the broad free enterprise party is fractured and broken apart. The only thing that brings it together is a compelling leader with a thoughtful platform that speaks to people, as opposed to just being anti-NDP. The public has to want you to win, and you have to put something in the window that's meaningful. John Rustad couldn't do that. Somebody new could.
What ultimately do you think led to the unraveling of his leadership, Marco? And how soon do you think David Eby goes to an election?
Well, I would defer to the Royal Court of St. Christy and St. James for the pulse of what's happening on the ground in BC. But I think it's exactly as was articulated, which is the inability of John Rustad to pull together a coalition that could compete against David Eby. And I actually think that is an opportunity for David Eby, given the economic agenda that has been laid out by the Prime Minister, which is not to say that it's easy. Certainly, we've seen over the past week with the signing of the MOU between Ottawa and Alberta that there can be friction. But I think a strong leader who has the advantage of not having a really compelling alternative in his province in BC, can marshal the forces of a broad coalition that cares about the economy, that cares about getting energy and resources to market, that cares about creating jobs, but that also cares about the environment as a way to drive cooperation. And when I think about the central thesis that the Prime Minister is showcasing, it is that Canada works. And that the way that it works is by stitching together the regional and disparate economies from coast to coast to coast, which again is not easy. But when you have a premier who isn't facing a strong opposition, then he has the ability to dip into a bit of the well of political goodwill to forge compromise. And so that would be my urging. And certainly by doing that, not only do I think we shore up confidence when it comes to our domestic economy, but it also puts the country on a much stronger footing when it comes to renegotiating trade around the world, including with our closest allies south of the border.
It's hard to overstate how wild a swing it's been since the election in BC. Corey, you've run a lot of campaigns. The story out of that election was David Eby almost lost. And the story now is he might be in such a good position, he wants to go to the polls much sooner. Like, what do you think went wrong for John Rustad? And do you think the party is salvageable under a different leader?
Well, I think you saw the party pulling itself apart on really secondary or third tier issues, as opposed to focusing on the big stuff. I think Eby is probably deceptively vulnerable if the BC Conservative Party can actually get its act together. You know, when you look at things like development and pipelines, you know, there's a huge number of votes there. You know, pushing 70% of the electorate is in favor of that sort of development, maybe with some caveats or asterisks on that. But overall, you know, you're dealing with a supermajority of people who want to see things move forward. You're also seeing issues like cost of living and, you know, jobs in the economy generally driving the issue set. And if you're to add another one, it would probably be crime. So, like, that's a very favorable issue environment for Conservatives. If you can find a leader that can focus on the big stuff and then put on a shelf some of the smaller issues that tend to tear at the core of a conservative free market coalition, then I think you've got a good basis for a winning campaign. But, you know, I guess we're going to see in the coming weeks whether, as Christy said, a leader that can do that emerges, that has enough strength to pull those threads together and to talk about the big stuff rather than getting sidelined on marginal stuff.
And Vashi, let's not forget how important this is to the national agenda, because if British Columbia stands in the way of pipelines, it stands in the way of all of that resource development. If British Columbia isn't ruled by someone who wants to cooperate with the federal government, and at the moment it's not, it makes it very, very difficult for the rest of the country to accomplish the goals we've set.
Okay, I got to leave it on that note. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. BC politics never boring, as you all know. Christy Clark, James Moore, Marco Mendicino, and Corey Tenek, our front bench. We're going to take another quick commercial break. On the other end of that break, we're going to turn to a domestic issue that matters a lot to parents. Ontario and the federal government agreed to extend their childcare agreement, but what's the fix for a woefully inadequate number of childcare spaces across the country? Families Minister Patty Hajdu is with us next, and I'll ask her. Ontario and the federal government announced today they've reached an agreement to extend Ottawa's national childcare program in the province. The program was set to expire at the end of March. The feds have set, however, a target for an average of $10 a day childcare across the country by April of next year. Will they hit that mark? I spoke with Jobs and Families Minister Patty Hajdu earlier about that. Have a listen to our conversation. Hi, Minister. Pleasure to welcome you back to studio. Appreciate you making the time. I want to start off on this childcare announcement. In particular, what I read from the press release was that it stipulates additional money to help maintain the average cost per day of $19 in Ontario. The overall program initially promised a reduction to an average of $10 a day by April of 2026. Is this a concession that won't happen?
It's a reflection that it's taking Ontario longer to get to $10 a day at the space creation target. So the agreement actually commits to additional spots and commits to stabilizing at, it's an average of $19 across Ontario, still saving the average family about $10,400 a year. So it's a big, big savings. And the parents I spoke to today were telling me all the different ways that they can use that money in their lives, in their families, how they're pursuing their education or careers. But it's also an acknowledgement that space creation has been challenging, both from a physical space perspective, as Minister Calandra talked about today, but also from a staffing perspective. And this gives everybody a little bit of breathing room to talk about the next steps.
I have some questions actually about space creation overall nationwide, because that was another tenet of the program and the promises made. But specifically on the price, Ontario is struggling, but it's not the only province. I believe the AG said as of March of 2024, 5 provinces and 3 territories had met the target, which meant that the others have not. Will the entire country be at $10 a day daycare average of by April or not?
Well, it's hard to predict, as you know.
I mean, you promised it, though. The government promised it.
Well, we promised it together with provinces and territories. And, we have inputs. We provide the funding. As you know, a large portion of that funding, provinces and territories also put money into their systems. But they control how fast those spaces can get created and how many people they can hire and how quickly. In some cases, it's a challenge about physical space. In some cases, it's having spots available without ECEs, early childhood educators, ready and able to work. So each province and territory that's struggling to reach $10 a day is facing different challenges, but we have been committed to work with them, and we will get to that goal.
When?
Again, I don't want to give you a date because provinces and territories are all at different speeds and they all have different challenges. I think those are really appropriate questions for the ministers responsible in the provinces.
Well, I'm not trying to absolve the provinces of responsibility here, but your government in particular made this promise. You said that it would result in a certain conclusion. I'm not saying the program has been ineffective. It's been far from that, actually. It's been a very effective program.
In fact, the Auditor General found that as well.
Yes, and I would not take away from that, but execution matters as well. And it's sort of my job to hold the government to account on the promises it makes and whether they execute on them. The number of spaces the AG flagged that have been created are sitting at not even half of what was promised 3 years in. The track record thus far does not, I don't think would imbue a sense of confidence among Canadians that the rest of them will be filled out by the date that you promised. Can you be honest with Canadians tonight? Like, is there any chance of meeting the target that you set out, your government set out?
There's always a chance of meeting the target, of course. But listen, what I would say is that we rely on the provinces and territories to find the spots, create the spots, and then staff those spots. And so the money that we've committed, as you know, it's about $35 billion so far overall to this program is a significant contribution. In fact, it's the majority of the contribution. And we have the capacity to work with provinces and territories in terms of the quantity of the investment, in terms of we have very stringent criteria and targets with provinces and territories. Just this morning, Minister Calandra was talking about the poor data that Ontario has and the improvement that he is pushing for in Ontario to be able to actually quantify what is happening in the system. So we'll be there to get to that goal, and we're going to continue to have these conversations with our counterparts.
Does there need to be more than a conversation, though? Does there need to be more accountability with the money that you are handing provinces? Like, I understand it allows the government to say, hey, this is the province's fault, but ultimately, these are, many moms and dads who I know who hope to take advantage of what sounded like a great program and instead find themselves on 3-year wait lists in various provinces, not just Ontario.
That's why it was exciting to hear Minister Calandra talk today about the need for better data in Ontario so that they can really target where the weaknesses are in their own provincial system. So today he spoke about that at length, and in fact that was part of our negotiations, was really drilling down to understand what spots have been created, what the gaps are, and what they're going to do next to actually add almost 40,000 spots in the next year. So that was a big part of the agreement today, was actually spot creation. I agree with you. Families need equity, and Canadians expect that if there's a program available, they want to be able to take advantage of that too. And we will push provinces and territories, and we'll make sure that we have the right inputs to get there.
Why does it take 3 years for you to make part of negotiations with provinces, though, that they collect better data? Again, I'll go back to the Auditor General, who flagged that, yes, she can identify how many spaces have and have not been created, but there is no data available for her to ascertain whether or not access is equivalent for lower income, middle income, high income. Like, there's no way to determine if the people who really needed $10 a day daycare are the ones who are benefiting from it. Again, isn't that central to execution?
Well, listen, I think we've had this challenge in a number of different spaces. I've been a minister for 10 years now and held a number of different portfolios during the pandemic. We had a really hard time getting health data out of provinces and territories in terms of who was getting sick and what hospital utilization rates were actually expressing themselves in the population. And so that data question in a federation is, I think, one of the most important. And it was very assuring today to hear Minister Calandra agree to be more diligent with his own ministry, with the Government of Ontario, to collect the data and to understand where the gaps are and where the weaknesses are in the system and what steps they're going to take to strengthen it. And in fact, he talked about the federal government being fierce in its demands for this data, and that's where we're going as a country. We have to be able to be, to your point, accountable to Canadians for the programs that we announce as a collective and that Canadians are then counting on. So that's the work. We heard the Auditor General and we're taking action.
So when will you be able to tell Canadians whether or not this program is working in the way 3 years ago you promised it would, and that the people who need more affordable childcare are actually accessing it.
What I would say is that Canadians all across the country are telling us that it is working. I mean, look, a savings in Ontario of $10,400 on average for a family is nothing to laugh at. I mean, these are big
I'm not laughing
numbers.
at it, to be clear,
And
but you're unable to say if a low-income family is benefiting that more than a high-income family.
Well,
That's a problem.
I think this program is universal, as you would know. And so the idea behind universal access is to make sure that no matter what your circumstance, that you are not going to, as a primary caregiver, most often women, miss out on the opportunity of earnings and on career trajectory. Look, this is an economic program, and I can tell you gender economists across the country celebrated when we launched this program in the way that we did. And you know why? Because productivity in Canada is lagging. And part of the productivity challenge is that women often, who are the primary caregivers, lose that essential time of career growth, which is part of the productivity challenge. And so look, we have the most women ever in the workforce, and we have women that are using those 3 to 5 years that possibly before they wouldn't have been able to participate in their chosen career to continue to grow their careers.
The thing I would say, Minister, is with respect, like you're mistaking my questions for criticism of the existence of the program. It's not. I benefited from the program. My own kid, you know what I mean? To be fully transparent, my kid was able to go, my daycare costs were reduced immensely. My questions are not about the existence of the program. It's a great thing that it exists. But I think all Canadians, including your government, should be worried about how much of a success it is. Could it be better? How much better could it be? Is it living up to the promise that your government initially made? And I think key to it, despite its universality, is to make childcare more affordable for the people who really need it. And your government at this time has no discernible data to be able to say that.
Well, actually, we're getting better. And I would say that we, first of all, heard the Auditor General, and that's why the negotiations with Ontario were so fierce, because we wanted that data, because we wanted to be able to quantify exactly what they've done, where they're going, and where the weaknesses are. And if at the announcement today, Minister Calandra talked about that, and he talked about actually the challenges in a system that's not used to that kind of granularity, that's quite fragmented. So his focus over the next year is going to be to make sure that in the next round of negotiations, they will have that data, and that we'll be able to report, he'll be able to report that to the federal government. And as we renegotiate with each province or territory, we'll have the same expectations of them as well. Because quite clearly, in a federation, data is challenging, and I've given you a couple of examples. But if we're going to be able to demonstrate to Canadians that programs are fair, that they're equitable, and that they're working, we have to be able to share data more effectively. And so I'm a bit of a policy wonk. I believe that numbers really matter, and I was really thrilled to see Ontario work so hard to get an agreement that includes that rigorous, robust data sharing.
That is Jobs and Families Minister Patty Hajdu. Coming up on Power Play, Energy Minister Tim Hodgson meets with the BC First Nations who oppose a potential new pipeline. Was any common ground found? Our Mike LeCouture was there in the room. He's going to be here in studio next.
What we talked about today was a process for how projects can be developed. They will be developed in partnership with First Nations. What we've said is there is no pipeline today. What we've said is if a proponent comes forward and they have a route, because there is no route today, then there will be discussions, and then people have a right to say what they believe, and that's their right.
Federal Energy Minister Tim Hodgson there after he met with the BC First Nations, who are vehemently opposed to a potential pipeline, bitumen pipeline, that would go to the Northwest Coast. The meeting happened on the sidelines of the Assembly of First Nations Summit here in Ottawa and comes exactly a week after the feds unveiled their big energy deal with Alberta. That deal could include a lift of the tanker ban, something else some BC First Nations don't want to see happen. CTV News spoke with some of the leaders there following the meeting. Here's what they had to say.
This MOU is a slap in the face of British Columbia. You know, they did this agreement without BC in mind.
So I suspect that the conversation has advanced, that there is a potential proponent or a conglomeration of proponents. So I think they're withholding information, and that's not a good faith action.
Our senior political correspondent, Mike LeCouture, was in that room for the meeting. He's here in studio with us now. Hey, Mike, set the context for this meeting. Like, why are all eyes on the minister meeting with, in particular, these leaders?
Because he made a comment last week about whether or not there was any consultation with these leaders. And he had flippantly kind of said, look, I can meet them over Zoom or I can connect with them over Zoom. And obviously that is not enough for these Indigenous leaders and leaders of First Nations at all. So the fact that he was supposed to be meeting there and in this sort of plenary session with a number of other ministers, including François-Philippe Champagne, the finance minister, also Defense Minister David McGuinty was supposed to be in that room. Then they disappeared from the actual schedule. And so that is when the question started to be asked, what happened here? Now, we had heard from his department, from his spokespeople. They gave us a statement saying there was a shuffling of the agenda by organizers from the federal government, not Natural Resources Canada, that resulted in the change of itinerary. He had also said he would have liked to have been in that session as well. So where all of this came from, not 100% sure. What was interesting is that in her closing remarks, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Cindy Woodhouse-Neepanak, did say that they did have a record number of cabinet ministers who were in attendance there, and she specifically said no ministers were ever uninvited, really basically putting it on the federal government and saying they were the ones that made the decision, not the AFN.
Just got about a minute. Did they find any common ground in that room while you were there?
It didn't seem like it, because a lot of that hour-long session was a number of chiefs getting up and saying that they weren't consulted, complaining about that. There was, speaking to Merle Alexander afterwards, the person who represents 2 BC coastal First Nations, he basically said, look, this is a warning. We weren't consulted, and any pipeline that tries to go through our territory will be met with resistance, not only in the courts, but also, he said, civil disobedience. And I asked him specifically afterwards, does this mean we're going to be looking at a 2020 Wet'suwet'en hereditary chief kind of protest that also spills over to other protests across the country? He said he couldn't speak for anybody else, but the First Nations on the BC coast, they will be protesting this for sure.
Okay. No proponent at this point, as the minister keeps saying, but I get it. Yeah.
But not yet.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much, Mike, our senior political correspondent, Mike LeCouture. We're back in a moment right here on Power Play. Welcome back to Power Play. All eyes will be on Washington, D.C. tomorrow for a couple of reasons. First, the FIFA World Cup draw will take place, we anticipate, around noon Eastern. But the bigger political story will be the meeting that takes place, a brief meeting, we are told, between Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump. President Trump is also expected to meet with Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum, but on a bilateral, not a trilateral basis, which is interesting considering all of the speculation around what happens with CUSMA, the free trade agreement between all 3 countries. The talks between Canada and the U.S. now have been on ice for weeks. I'm going to leave Power Play there. Thanks for watching. Have a great rest of your night.